So in 1804, the French civil code, the Code Napoleon, codified this fascinating but, deeply chilling legal standard.
Oh, right, the adultery laws.
Yeah, exactly. It explicitly protected a husband's legal right to cheat on his wife.
Wow.
I mean, the only caveat was that he couldn't physically move his mistress into the conjugal home. But aside from that, infidelity was totally shielded for the man, while female infidelity was just fiercely punished.
It's just a completely blatant double standard built right into the law.
Right. And today, you and I tend to view marriage as this eternal emotional bond, right? Like a bedrock institution handed down by nature itself.
That's definitely the standard assumption we all grow up with.
But if we dive into the foundational texts of Marxism today, you'll find a really jarring argument. They argue the modern family wasn't created by romance or biology at all.
No, not even a little bit.
It was created by ledgers, livestock, and this massive historic inheritance crisis.
Which really forces a complete reevaluation of how we understand our most intimate relationships. I mean, we are so conditioned to think of the family as an emotional sanctuary.
Like a safe haven from the economy.
Exactly. Completely insulated from the outside world. But the texts we are exploring today argue the exact opposite.
Right.
They say the family unit is, and always has been, a direct mirror of the economic system it exists within.
And that brings us to the mission for today's deep dive. We are plunging straight into the Marx and Engels collected works.
It's going to be a heavy one.
Oh, definitely. We'll be synthesizing some of their most heavily scrutinized arguments from texts like The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State.
Also Capital, the German ideology, and of course, the Communist Manifesto.
Right. And our specific lens today is their theory regarding the origins, the evolution, and the future of the family unit, as well as the emancipation of women.
But before we begin tracing that whole timeline, I really want to establish some ground rules for you, the listener, regarding how we are handling this material.
Yeah, a vital disclaimer here.
Because these texts contain highly politically charged foundational Marxist theories.
Very controversial stuff.
Right. And because of that, we will not be taking any sides or endorsing these viewpoints today. That just isn't our role.
We're not here to argue for or against it.
Exactly. Our goal is strictly to impartially unpack and report on these ideas exactly as they are presented in the original source material. We're essentially acting as your neutral guides through a really dense and often quite controversial historical framework.
So, to truly grasp the arguments being made about the modern family, we actually have to abandon the modern era completely.
We have to go way, way back.
Right? We have to rewind to how these authors viewed human prehistory. Because if the nuclear family isn't biological, then the obvious question is, well, what did our biology actually demand of us when we were just trying to survive the Pleistocene?
And the foundational text for this era in their framework is Engels' The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State.
But he wasn't just making this up, right?
No, not at all. He wasn't pulling this out of thin air. He was heavily relying on the anthropological work of Lewis H. Morgan.
The American scientist.
Yeah, a 19th century American anthropologist. Morgan spent years studying the kinship structures of the Iroquois Native Americans.
Okay.
And his findings in his book, Ancient Society, absolutely blew Marx and Engels away.
It just completely validated their theories.
It really did. Morgan divided early human development into savagery, barbarism, and civilization.
And Engels adopts that framework.
Yes, to argue that the family is not a stationary institution, it's fluid. It advances and changes as the material conditions of society advance and change.
So if we look at that earliest stage, what they categorize as savagery, a strict, isolated nuclear family, just seems like a terrible evolutionary strategy.
Oh, it would be a disaster.
Right. Because if the father is injured or the mother dies, that isolated little unit just collapses.
They wouldn't survive a week.
So early humans must have relied on a much wider, kind of intertwined safety net just to avoid starvation or, predation.
They absolutely did. And the texts refer to this survival unit as the horde.
The horde.
Right. To survive against predators and the elements, humans required the united strength and the joint effort of a really large group.
Makes sense.
But for a large horde to exist peacefully, there was a strict social prerequisite, which was mutual toleration among the adult males.
Which means eliminating violent competition over partners.
Exactly.
Because if the men are constantly killing each other over exclusive rights to women, the horde splinters and everyone gets eaten by a saber-toothed tiger.
That is the exact mechanism Engels describes, yeah. The jealousy of the male, which dictates exclusive possession of a female, is an instinct that would have brought the individual into direct conflict with the collective.
So it's actively anti-survival.
Yes. Therefore, for humans to evolve out of the isolated animal stage and form cooperative societies, male jealousy had to be practically absent.
Wow.
And this necessity birthed early forms of what the texts call group marriage.
Okay, let's break down what group marriage actually meant in practice. Because I know the texts mention specific evolutionary stages here, like the consanguine family and the pornaluan family.
Right, so the consanguine family is posited as the first step.
How did that work?
In this structure, marriage groups were separated purely by generation.
Yeah.
So all the grandfathers and grandmothers within the limits of the family are mutually husbands and wives to one another.
Okay, so a horizontal slice.
Exactly. Their children constitute the next circle of mutual mates and so on. But as societies evolve, the texts argue they recognize the biological and social need to prevent incest.
Which leads to the next stage.
Right. The Punaluan family, where sexual relations between siblings and eventually cousins were systematically prohibited.
So it wasn't just a group of completely random individuals.
No, it was heavily structured.
You might have like a group of brothers and their male cousins mutually married to a group of sisters and their female cousins from a completely different lineage.
Yes, that's a great way to picture it.
But that creates a massive logistical puzzle, doesn't it? If you have multiple men and multiple women all reproducing within a shared group structure.
Tracing paternity becomes a biological impossibility.
Right. You can't run a DNA test.
Exactly. Paternity is entirely unprovable in this scenario. And that is the pivotal mechanism that defined early human society for them.
Because you can't prove who the father is.
Because paternity was impossible to prove with absolute certainty, lineage could only be traced through one line, the female line.
Because you always know who gave birth to a child.
Exactly. You physically witnessed the birth. This system of tracing descent exclusively through the mother is referred to in the texts as mother right.
Mother right. Okay.
Yeah.
So if descent and kinship and social belonging are all flowing exclusively through the women of the tribe, that must have fundamentally dictated the status of women in these early societies.
Oh, it placed them in a highly respected, exceptionally free position. Yes. Under mother right, the household was what the texts call communistic. By that, they mean a large number of families lived together in shared structures.
Like those Iroquois longhouses Morgan studied.
Exactly like those. And in these shared spaces, the women managed a socially necessary collective domestic economy.
Now, the modern assumption is usually that, well, men went out and did the real work of hunting, right? While women stayed behind in this subordinate domestic role.
That's the cliche, yeah.
But these texts are arguing that in a communistic household, domestic work wasn't subordinate at all.
Not in the slightest. I mean, a division of labor absolutely existed.
Right. Men hunting, women gathering.
Yes. Men hunting, fishing, or warring, while women managed the household, prepared food, and gathered. But because the household was a communal public industry, the women's work was considered just as vital for the survival of the group as the men's work.
Like an early-stage startup where the equity is split completely evenly.
That's a great analogy.
The person running the internal operations is just as powerful and respected as the person doing outside sales.
Precisely. And Engels actually notes a really interesting etymological fact here.
Oh, I love a good word origin.
The English word lady actually derives from an Old English word, leftage, which means loaf kneader or mistress of the house.
Loaf kneader.
Yeah. In the era of mother right, the woman was the mistress of the house in a very real, authoritative, and public sense.
But we're taking Morgan's 19th century anthropology as our baseline here, and the texts explicitly argue against the conservative Victorian backlash of their time, right?
Oh, there was massive pushback.
Yeah, because the critics at the time claimed this concept of group marriage was just some chaotic free-for-all prehistoric brothel.
And Engels actively ridicules that idea. He calls it the Philistine imagination of a brothel.
Philistine, he loves that word.
He really does. He argues that group marriage was incredibly structured. It wasn't about unrestrained lust or anything like that. It was a highly organized system of kinship driven by complex tribal rules and really strict incest taboos.
And those taboos acted as an evolutionary mechanism.
Precisely. Over generations, as these societies slowly introduced prohibitions, narrowing the circle of permitted partners further and further, group marriage organically became impossible.
It just couldn't sustain itself logistically.
Right. It naturally evolved toward what they call the pairing family, where one man and one woman paired off for longer periods.
But crucially, under Mother Right, this pairing was still a loose bond, right?
Very loose. It was easily dissolved by either party, and if they split, the children remained part of the mother's clan.
Okay, so if we have this era of Mother Right where women are respected, the household is communal, the economic value of labor is recognized equally across gender lines.
The golden age, in a way.
Right, the obvious question is, how did we lose it?
Yeah.
Because the shift to global male domination is so ubiquitous today that it really feels biologically hardwired.
It does feel that way.
But the texts argue it wasn't biology at all. It was actually driven by a specific technological and economic revolution.
Yes. The texts trace this massive shift to the stage of barbarism, specifically the agricultural and pastoral revolutions.
Okay, so farming and herding.
Humans learned to domesticate wild animals, they bred massive herds of cattle, they started forging metal tools, and they acquired human slaves through warfare.
So suddenly, for the first time in human history, society was generating a massive surplus of wealth.
Huge amounts of wealth. It was completely unprecedented.
And because of the existing division of labor we talked about earlier, the men possessed the keys to this new wealth.
Exactly.
Because if men were traditionally the hunters, and society shifts from hunting wild animals to breeding and herding them, the men naturally maintain control of the livestock.
That is the exact mechanism they point to. The man was traditionally responsible for procuring food and the tools necessary for it.
Right.
Therefore, the man became the owner of the new food sources, the herds of cattle, and the new means of labor, including the slaves.
But this creates a historic systemic crisis.
An ultimate crisis.
Because the man is accumulating all this unprecedented wealth, the flocks, the herds, the tools.
Yeah.
But under the rules of Mother Right, his own biological children are legally cut out of his will.
It is the ultimate inheritance crisis. Under Mother Right, a man's children belong to their mother's gens, or clan.
Not his.
Right. A man's wealth had to remain within his own clan. So when he died, his vast new herds wouldn't go to his sons.
Who would they go to?
They would pass to his brothers, his sisters, or his sisters' children.
Wow. Think about that from the perspective of a man who has just spent a lifetime amassing a fortune. The economic stimulus to overthrow the traditional rules of inheritance must have been absolutely overwhelming.
It was. As wealth increased, it elevated the man to a much more important status in the family than the woman.
He had the leverage.
He had all the economic leverage, and he used it to fundamentally rewrite the rules of society.
Just completely upended it.
Yes, to pass wealth to his own children. Man overthrew Mother Right. He instituted Father Right, meaning descent and inheritance would now be traced exclusively through the male line.
Which Engels has a very dramatic phrase for, right?
He does. He refers to this specific moment as the world historic defeat of the female sex.
The world historic defeat.
It's a powerful phrase.
It's like a massive terms of service update for all of human society, executed overnight by the administrators just to secure their own assets.
That is an amazing way to put it.
And it permanently locks half the users out of the system.
That analogy captures the structural suddenness of it perfectly. This revolution birthed the patriarchal family and subsequently strict monogamy.
But the texts are very clear. This new monogamy was not born out of individual sex love or romance or anything like that.
Not even slightly. It was a rigid, cold economic contract.
Because if inheritance is now traced through the male line, the man needs 100% certainty that the child inheriting his wealth is actually his.
Exactly. The sole purpose of this new monogamy was to guarantee undisputed paternity.
Right.
And to ensure that the heirs were definitely his, the woman was placed under the man's absolute power.
Which is just brutal.
Engels writes that the woman was degraded, enthralled, and became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children.
A mere instrument. And what happens to the concept of the household?
Mm-hmm.
Because under Mother Right, we said women managing the communal longhouse were engaging in this vital public industry.
That completely changes. The administration of the household lost its public socially necessary character.
It got privatized.
Completely. It became a private service. The wife became, in the words of the text, the first domestic servant. She was pushed entirely out of participation in social production.
Which brings us back to that 1804 French Civil Code we talked about at the very beginning. The texts highlight a glaring hypocrisy in this whole system, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. The hypocrisy is the point.
Because monogamy was brutally strict, but only for the women.
Yes. While strict fidelity was demanded of the women and enforced by cruel punishments, social ostracization, or even the man's legal right to kill her for infidelity.
Right, literal death sentences.
Men retained the right to overt or covert polygamy. The Code of Napoleon was really just a formal legal expression of a double standard that had existed for millennia.
So the texts view this era not as some beautiful reconciliation of the sexes, but literally as the genesis of class warfare.
Yes. In an unpublished 1846 manuscript, Marx and Engels actually wrote that the first-class antithesis in history coincides with the development of the antagonism between man and woman in monogamy and marriage.
Wow.
And that the first-class oppression is that of the female sex by the male.
Okay, so the family is basically rebuilt as a fortress. Its walls are designed to protect and transmit private property. The man holds the keys, the woman is relegated to private domestic service, and the children are the heirs.
That's the structure.
But this leads us to a fascinating historical collision.
It does.
If the patriarchal family is entirely predicated on the transmission of private property, what happens to this rigid structure when you fast forward to a time when a massive portion of the population suddenly has absolutely no property to pass down?
Right. What happens when the wealth is gone?
Exactly. We enter the 19th century Industrial Revolution.
And the documentation of this era, heavily detailed in Marx's Capital and Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England, provides a really grim answer to that question.
Set the scene for us here. We are in the 1800s. The steam engine's roaring, and massive factories are springing up all across Europe. What happens to the propertyless working-class family?
Well, with the rise of heavy machinery, the demand for sheer muscular strength completely evaporated.
Because the machines are doing the heavy lifting.
Exactly. Capitalists realized they no longer needed to hire adult men. They could hire women and children who possessed what the texts call supple limbs.
Supple limbs, meaning they could reach into the machines.
Yes. And, more importantly to the factory owners, they were significantly cheaper and much easier to control.
Now, the source material here doesn't just deal in abstract economic theory, which I think is important to note.
No, it gets very granular.
Marx and Engels pulled directly from official English factory inspectors' reports, public health commissions, and doctors of the time. And the exploitation they document is just a dystopian nightmare.
It is deeply disturbing to read. The texts meticulously document how the capitalist pursuit of surplus value physically destroyed the working-class body.
Let's give some examples. Imagine you are a lace finisher in Nottingham during this era. The texts describe workrooms known as mistresses' houses.
Right, and these were often just small, completely unventilated rooms where groups of women and young girls were packed together.
Like sardines.
The reports describe these rooms having only 67 to 100 cubic feet of space per person.
Wait, really? Let's put that in perspective.
To put that in perspective, that is less breathing space than a soldier was allotted in a military hospital at the time.
And the workers in these rooms weren't just adults.
No, not at all. Children began working in lace finishing at the age of 4 to 6 years old.
4 years old.
4 years old. And they worked 14 to 16-hour days.
That is just incomprehensible.
And the work required following incredibly fine threads through complex textures, which caused rampant premature blindness.
Because the lighting was terrible, I assume.
Terrible lighting, tiny threads. And because the delicate white lace had to be kept immaculately clean, these children were frequently forced to take off their shoes in the dead of winter.
Oh my God.
Yes, standing on tiled floors in freezing temperatures just to ensure no dirt got on the product.
The sheer physical toll is unimaginable.
Yeah.
And it extended across industries, too. The texts mention the glassblowers as well.
Right. In the glass factories, children were working in ambient temperatures of 100 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit.
Basically an oven.
Literally. The texts describe them standing on wooden boards that literally caught fire beneath their feet from the intense heat of the furnaces.
While they're standing up.
Yes. And they suffered from stunted growth, severe bowel complaints, and terrible eye afflictions.
Then you had the dressmakers in London. The texts note there were about 15,000 girls working in London dressmaking.
And during the fashionable season, when the upper classes needed their gowns for a period of about 4 months, these girls would work 15 to 22-hour shifts.
22 hours. There's only 24 hours in a day.
Sometimes they were forced to work the entire night through. They slept on thin mattresses in incredibly foul air.
Just breathing in the dust and fabric.
And the texts recount horrific details from inspectors. In some cases, these girls were kept working so continuously that their food was served to them already cut up.
Wait, why?
Because the employers wanted to minimize the seconds spent chewing and swallowing so the girls wouldn't have to stop working their needles.
That is, wow. I mean, if you take women and children and throw them into this absolute meat grinder, working 15 hours a day, the family unit at home doesn't just suffer, it completely dissolves.
It evaporates. The traditional family structure evaporated. When a wife and mother spends 13 hours a day in a mill, she physically cannot be a mother.
She's barely surviving herself.
Exactly. The texts describe how infants were put out to nurse or left with very young siblings.
Right.
And to suppress their hunger and keep them quiet while the parents worked, children were routinely dosed with a concoction called Godfrey's cordial.
Which was basically an opiate, right?
Yes, it was an opiate.
They were drugging babies so the mothers could go weave cotton for 14 hours.
Exactly. And as the children grew up in the factories, earning their own wages as young as 9 years old, they became entirely alienated from their parents.
Because they're basically independent earners.
Right. By the time they were 14 or 15, they began treating their parental home as a mere boarding house.
Like they were just renting a room.
They would hand over a fixed amount for food and lodging and keep the rest of their wages, practically emancipating themselves from parental authority entirely.
The grotesque irony here is just unavoidable. Capitalism is a system utterly obsessed with and built upon the legal sanctity of private property.
Absolutely.
And yet, for the vast majority of people, the propertyless working-class capitalist industry was actively, physically destroying the very family unit the ruling class claimed to hold sacred.
That's the contradiction.
The father's authority is totally stripped away because he might be unemployed while his wife and children are the primary breadwinners.
The inversion of the traditional social order was complete. The texts describe how this role reversal stripped the man of his traditional masculinity and the woman of her womanliness.
Degrading both of them.
Exactly. Degrading both sexes under the weight of sheer exploitation.
But wait, the texts quote factory inspectors, public doctors, and politicians who are expressing profound outrage at this.
Yeah.
Weren't the capitalists trying to fix it? Like, wasn't there reform happening?
Well, this is where Marx points his searing critique at the hypocrisy of the bourgeoisie.
Oh, he goes after them.
He notes that the ruling classes wept what he called crocodile tears over the loss of the family and the moral degradation of the workers.
Right, they pretended to care.
Yet their economic system, their ledgers, and their profit margins actively required the continuous, reckless exploitation of these exact same women and children.
It was built into the math.
When laws were finally proposed to limit the labor of children to only 6 hours a day, the manufacturers fought it tooth and nail.
On what grounds?
They claimed it interfered with freedom of labor.
Freedom of labor. The freedom for a 4-year-old to go blind standing on a freezing floor for 16 hours a day.
It's a very dark irony.
Sickening. But here's where we reach a major philosophical pivot in the text, which I think is crucial to understand. The conditions in the factories were a dystopian nightmare.
Unquestionably.
Yet Marx and Engels argue that within this horrific, toxic exploitation lay the actual material seeds of true emancipation.
Yes. And to understand this, we have to look at the dialectical logic driving their argument.
Okay, let's unpack dialectics a bit.
Dialectics essentially argues that history moves forward through contradiction. You have a thesis, an existing state of affairs. It generates its own opposite, an antithesis.
Right.
These two forces clash, and out of that conflict arises a new synthesis.
Let's ground that dialectical theory in the history we just covered, just to make it concrete. So the thesis is the patriarchal family, right? Where women are economically dependent domestic servants.
Yes, and the antithesis is the capitalist factory system, which brutally exploits women but simultaneously forces them out of the home and back into the public workforce.
And the synthesis is what emerges from that wreckage.
Exactly. The texts do not romanticize the factory system at all. They condemn it as monstrous.
Totally.
But they also view it as a necessary evolutionary step because of what it destroyed. Remember, the oppression of women began when they were pushed out of social public production and relegated to private domestic service.
Right. Completely economically dependent on the man.
So, By ruthlessly dragging women out of the isolated domestic sphere and back into social production, capitalism was inadvertently destroying the material economic foundation of male domination.
It was demolishing the economic scaffolding of patriarchy.
Precisely. In the proletarian home, there was no property, no wealth, and no capital to pass down to heirs.
So there's no inheritance crisis.
Right. Therefore, there was no economic stimulus to assert male domination, and no bourgeois legal apparatus that the working man could even afford to use against his wife anyway.
You know, it's like a city using a wrecking ball to demolish a structurally unsound, deeply toxic building, but they don't bother evacuating the tenants first.
Ah, that's a brilliant way to frame it.
The demolition clears the lot to build something better eventually, but the immediate human cost for the people caught inside the collapsing building is staggering.
Exactly. The proletarian marriage, despite the miseries of crushing poverty, was stripped of property calculations.
So it was somewhat more equal.
In a functional sense, yes. The woman, now earning her own wage and participating in public industry, had regained a degree of economic independence.
She had leverage again.
And with it, the practical right to dissolve a marriage if it didn't work. The texts argue that the last remnants of male domination in the proletarian home had lost all foundation.
Except maybe the lingering physical abuse.
Right, except perhaps for the lingering physical brutality that had become rooted during centuries of monogamy.
I have to challenge the author's perspective here, though. Reading these detached theoretical arguments about the dialectic of history, did Marx and Engels actually care about the immediate physical suffering of these women caught in the wrecking ball?
It's a very common and vital critique to raise.
Because it can sound like they were just coldly analyzing a historical process from a comfortable armchair in London.
The texts are notoriously analytical, yes. But if we look at their correspondence, we see a much more pragmatic concern for the immediate victims.
Okay, so they weren't completely heartless about the present.
No, not at all. There is a specific letter Engels wrote to a socialist colleague where he recounts debates about female labor.
What does he say?
Engels explicitly states that while he wants ultimate, true equality for women in the future, he is deeply concerned with protecting the physical health of women right now.
So he isn't just saying, let them suffer for the sake of the post-revolutionary future.
No, he argues that because of women's specific physiological functions and for the health of the coming generation, the working woman requires special immediate protection against capitalist exploitation.
Even if it contradicts a strict formal equality.
Yes. He actually criticizes certain bourgeois women's rights advocates of his time who championed a strictly formal equality.
Meaning they wanted exactly the same rules for men and women in the factories.
Right. They argued that women should have the equal right to be just as thoroughly and ruthlessly exploited in the factories as men without any legal caps on their hours.
Wow. Equality and suffering.
Exactly. Engels supported protective factory acts to limit women's hours, prioritizing their physical survival over a theoretical formal equality under a brutal capitalist system.
So they do recognize the immediate suffering, but they still see the entry of women into the workforce as the necessary demolition of the old order?
Yes, the dialectic demands it.
Okay, so if the old patriarchal family is demolished by propertyless poverty, and the current capitalist system is an exploitative nightmare, what exactly is the synthesis?
Where do you go from here?
Right. Where does the cleared lot leave us? What is the future of the family, according to these works?
The texts argue that true emancipation requires two fundamental structural changes to society.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, the full permanent reintroduction of the entire female sex into public industry.
Okay, we kind of touched on that.
And second, the abolition of the individual family as the economic unit of society.
Abolishing the family as an economic unit. What does that actually look like on a practical, day-to-day level? Because to be honest, it sounds like everyone living in giant sterile barracks.
It's a very common misconception. But it's not about destroying emotional bonds at all. It's about socializing the labor that keeps a family alive.
What does that mean?
The texts argue that private housekeeping must become a public, socialized industry. The care and upbringing of children must become a public affair.
Oh, I see. So we are talking about universal childcare, communal dining halls, socialized laundry services.
Exactly.
The material burden of survival, cooking, cleaning, rearing children is lifted from the shoulders of the individual woman and assumed by society as a collective whole.
Society would take care of all children equally, irrespective of whether they are born in or out of wedlock.
Because legitimacy doesn't matter anymore.
Exactly. The stigma of illegitimacy vanishes because inheritance is no longer a factor.
Right. Because the other half of this equation is the abolition of private property itself.
The core Marxist tenet.
If you abolish private property, meaning the social ownership of the means of production like factories, land, and capital, then the anxiety over inheritance disappears entirely.
You no longer need to control a woman's reproductive capacity to ensure a legitimate heir to your factory because the factory belongs to society.
It completely removes the economic incentive for patriarchy.
This leads to the ultimate, perhaps counterintuitive irony of the text's view on monogamy.
Which is?
The texts argue that by stripping away property, inheritance, and the economic dependence of women on men, true monogamy will not be destroyed. Rather, it will finally become a reality.
Because right now, historically speaking, what we call monogamy has actually just been a financial arrangement riddled with adultery.
Exactly. Once you remove all secondary economic considerations, the need for a woman to marry for financial security, the need for a man to marry for legitimate heirs, what is left?
Just the people.
Only mutual affection. Only what the texts call individual sex love.
So marriages will be based solely on genuine affection.
Yes. And crucially, if the love ends, the marriage can simply dissolve.
No messy legal battles.
Engels writes that people will be spared the experience of wading through the useless mire of divorce proceedings. They just part ways as equals without anyone facing financial ruin.
You know, if you read the history of how these texts were received in the 19th century, the bourgeoisie completely lost their minds over this proposition.
Oh, they panicked.
They accused the communists of wanting to introduce a community of women.
Yes.
Basically, mandatory wife sharing.
It is perhaps the most famous and most visceral accusation leveled against the texts.
Yeah. How do they dissect that accusation? Because it sounds wild.
Well, if we look at the Communist Manifesto and earlier works like The Holy Family, Marx and Engels actually openly mock this idea.
Really? They joke about it.
They point out the psychological projection of the ruling class. They argue that the bourgeoisie already treats their own wives as mere instruments of production.
Right.
And that they hypocritically participate in the real community of women through widespread prostitution and adultery.
Oh, wow. So they turn it right back around on them.
Completely. The bourgeoisie hears that the communists want to socialize the instruments of production. And because the bourgeoisie currently views women as property, as instruments of production, they automatically assume that means women will be socialized too.
That is pure projection. The capitalists think women are property, so they assume socializing property means socializing women.
The texts assert the exact opposite.
Right.
By abolishing the status of women as property, communism will actually end the community of women by eradicating prostitution and marriages of economic convenience, not create it.
Okay, let's take a breath and recap this immense historical arc we just went through.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It really is. We started in the egalitarian communistic households of prehistory, where women held power and respect under mother right, and survival depended on mutual cooperation.
Right.
Then the invention of private wealth, the domestication of animals and land, caused a hostile takeover, resulting in the patriarchal enclosures where women became the first domestic servants simply to ensure inheritance.
Then we moved into the brutal realities of the 19th century Industrial Revolution,
where the capitalist machine ground the working class family into dust, but inadvertently forced women back into social production.
destroying the economic basis for male domination in the process.
And finally, we arrived at the synthesis, the text's proposed future. A world where socialized domestic labor and the abolition of private property allow for human relationships to be based purely on genuine affection, utterly free from financial coercion.
Which brings us to a final lingering thought from the text to mull over.
Let's hear it.
In The Origin of the Family, Engels speculates about the psychology of a future generation of men and women who will grow up in this new society.
Okay.
He writes that a generation raised without ever having to buy a partner with money or surrender to someone out of economic fear will not care a damn about what we today think they should do.
I love that.
They will establish their own practice and their own public opinion. Well, he says, and that's the end of it.
Will not care a damn about what we today think they should do. It really makes you wonder, you know?
It really does.
If every single ounce of economic pressure, financial anxiety, and the need for material security was magically removed from our society tomorrow, how many of our current relationship norms would actually survive?
It's a profound question.
And what entirely new, unimaginable forms of human connection might organically take their place? Something to think about the next time you look at a traditional family portrait.